The numbers are much larger. At present, we have more than 200 million people living outside the country of their birth. So we have the largest number of people living abroad that have migrated abroad. Of course, we're now about 7.2 billion people, so we have a larger base. The percentage is relatively the same. In addition, it varies by country. Of course, the United States now is seeing a huge increase in the number of migrants coming to the country. We'll probably reach the peak period that occurred in the beginning of the 20th century. In terms of the numbers, we're much greater, and in terms of the proportion, we're going to be matching that, and my guess is will it be exceeding that. The crisis in Syria has a long history. The majority of the population are Sunni. The government is not Sunni. It's sort of the reverse of what happened in Iraq. So you have a minority group that's in power over a majority group that is increasingly troubled by the governance. So they have a population of about 22 million, and a large proportion of those people were trying to have reform, many of them looking for a more democratic means. So we have a large number of them who have been internally displaced, 3-4 million at least, and several million that have left the country, many in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and increasing numbers fleeing to Europe across the Mediterranean, often from Libya or Egypt or even through Turkey. This appears to be going to be the largest refugee crisis that we had. Right now, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees is indicating this is the largest number of refugees that we've had since World War II. I think the system is under crisis right now. Not only are the numbers growing extremely rapidly, but the demands put on the neighboring countries are enormous. For example, Lebanon, a country of several million, 3-4 million, now is having a million or more refugees entering from Syria. Imagine that if that happened in the U.S. We have about 320 million almost, and if we had 70, 80 million coming into the country, that would be overwhelming to the country. And that's what's happening to countries. And it's not adding a stabilizing factor, it's at the opposite. It's adding a destabilizing factor to those countries, Jordan and Lebanon in particular. Lebanon and many of the other countries surrounding it are very wary of having refugee camps based on the experience that happened when the formation of Israel and the Palestinians were put in camps with UNRWA. They see this as not a temporary thing, but often a permanent type of situation. Lebanon is a fragile country having basically 16 major religious groups. They have a confessional system, meaning that all the posts are sort of top posts in the government are assigned to religious groups. For example, the president is Maronite, prime minister is Sunni Muslim, speaker of the House is Shia, and so on through the government. And the demographics have altered this balance, and the consequences are some of the groups are smaller than they used to be, some are larger, and individuals, like every country, want to have a fair voice in who represents them and what their vote should be. And that's the transformation that's going on in Lebanon and many of the other countries. All of the above. They have economic issues. The oil in the Gulf area, of course, has been a mixed blessing. Lots of money coming in. Where does that money go? How do you invest it? Spills over. In addition, we have high unemployment. Many of the youths are not suited in their education for the modern economy that we have. We have a great deal of migration moving on in the area, people coming from South Asia, East Asia to work in the Gulf and in that area. And we're seeing a great deal of uprising to sort of undo what has been in the past. And of course, the West has been involved in this from the very beginning of the 20th century. Supporting various groups, deposing other groups, and this contributes to the lack of stability. But unemployment, some poverty, some excess wealth, and the extremes contributes to this lack of stability. A lot of it, of course, the ones leaving are Sunni and other minorities, a good number of Christians also leaving, as we've seen also in Iraq. And the areas they go to, of course, are the ones that are closest. If they're close to the northern border with Turkey, they'll go there. If they're close to the Lebanese border, they will go there. A lot of them, of course, are more familiar with Lebanon and Jordan, similar language, Arabic and so on, and they're more likely to go there. And some, of course, have friends or relatives that are in those countries, so they're going there. However, the problem comes in is, what do you do with such large numbers? They're in camps, they have great needs. What kind of work can they do? How does it affect the local economy and employment, people seeking work, undercutting normal working conditions of the natives, and destabilizing other countries, because how long will they stay? What rights do they have? It's a familiar issue, but on a very large scale. We see it in many countries in Europe, in North America, in South and East Asia. People coming in that are somewhat different, and when the number is small, it's fairly simple to absorb them. When the number becomes very large, then it's much more problematic. It depends on the circumstances. The countries, for example, Afghanistan, a good number are returning. There were refugees in other instances. Some African countries, they would be returning after there was some stability. But often, as we've seen in some areas, such as the Palestinians, they're not returning. They're staying in those camps, or they've gone elsewhere. And the host countries often are very skeptical about assurances from the international community that these people would be returning when there's peace. It's a normal thing. People move to a new location, they set up temporary homes, and then their children start getting accommodated in the community, they get new friends, they start learning the language, they go to school, and after a while it's very difficult to leave. So they may stay there for some time. Well, most of these countries are really very young. You can have half the population under 18. So you're going to have very, very young population. Often the refugee population is half children at least. So you can have something like 75% women and children, another quarter men. It depends on the conflict. Sometimes the men are at the front line. Some of the men have been killed. Some have been captured. But the majority largely are dependents, children and women who are caring for the children. The numbers that I've seen in terms of the number of men who are involved in the conflict are relatively small. Most are trying to save their families and take them to safety. There's a small number that's participating. Also, we have had people from outside the country involved, supporting one side or the other. It's a very complicated issue, and getting reliable data is not an easy task. How many are involved, how many are not involved. But it's very clear it's a serious civil war conflict. And countries that have gone through it in the past, it doesn't end after 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It takes years, and even after the conflict is officially over, you have resentment and all sorts of adjustments. Our civil war in the United States took 4 or 5 years, but the after effects are still being felt today. With the Syrian crisis, of course, we have Lebanon, we have Jordan, we have Turkey. They're spilling over also across the Mediterranean. Many of the refugees are going to Europe, the European Union, often bypassing Italy and Southern Europe and moving northward. Some are trying to go to the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Some are trying to get to Great Britain because of language, English, and so on. Some are also going to Germany. And some actually don't make it. They drowned on their desperate trip across the Mediterranean. And the Frontex, which is the European Union's naval group dealing with this, are finding thousands of people, as you read in the papers, that have not made it across the Mediterranean because they're going across in unsafe ships and boats and having difficult times crossing. So this is a very much a humanitarian crisis dealing with the Syrian refugees. Many of the European countries have had experience before with the Arab Spring, the Tunisians, the Egyptians, and so on. And we saw the response. The Italians said, sure, you can go to France. Just let them go to France. At that time, President Sarkozy was not very enthusiastic. He wanted to send them back. So the Europeans are having a difficult time also dealing with this wave of migrants coming through. And we also see the migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa through Morocco, trying to get to Spain. So this will continue. This is not a short-term thing that's going to be over soon. It's going to be enormous migration streams moving from the south to the north, affecting Europe. And as we've seen in the U.S., this flow will also continue from our southern border, coming from Central America and South America to the United States. Many of them are in vehicles, any way they can get out, trucks, cars, buses. Some walk out if they're close enough. Some may use burros, but most of them are going by land, by trucks and buses and cars. Some of them went out early, some of them tried to stay. As the conflict gets worse, people then decide it's time to leave. And many of them got into Lebanon and then tried to go further by sea to Europe, either going back down to Egypt through ships and going up, but a lot of them also through Turkey. The dilemma comes in is what resources do you have? How do you get there? If someone can be smuggling you, are you being trafficked? It's very much a humanitarian crisis because of the extent of the numbers and the region. On the Eastern Front, of course, we have destabilized Iraq, the conflict there, how to deal with that, the lack of stability in Lebanon. Then, of course, we have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So every which way you look, there are problems. I think there are some that have tried to see who's coming in. There hasn't been that much trying to see who's trying to leave. The Lebanese were concerned about how many were coming in. Assad's regime was concerned about who's coming in to support the rebels. The same with Turkey. Some of the countries are concerned who's coming in. Are they basically refugees, or are they other groups that are likely to create difficulties in those countries? It's very difficult to siphon them out and see who is actually a legitimate refugee and who may be someone who's looking to create problems. The numbers of this type of thing are very difficult. They're in the hundreds of thousands. What happens is you don't have someone sitting there with a flip chart counting them, but many of the families have been reporting missing members of their family, especially men, young men, and towns have been bombed and so on. So we're talking close in the hundreds of thousands. And it's been going on for many, many months, and we don't see an end happening soon. Well, as we know, in the past, there were some red lines for the European Union and the United States. Chemical weapons apparently were used, according to the news reports. They did come up with a diplomatic solution to get rid of the chemical weapons. It's difficult for the European Union and the Americans and their allies to support a group. We did the same thing when we were in Afghanistan early on, supporting one group, and in the end you find out that group turns out to be not your friendly group, but someone who's likely to be fighting you in the future. So we have to be very careful to see if the rebels are indeed those looking for democracy, or they're just rebels being supported by Al-Qaeda or the new groups that are coming in, the ISIS. Who are we funding? Which groups are getting the arms, and will they be used against the Americans, the European Union, and their allies in the future? So it's very much a balancing act. Clearly, the only real long-term solution is trying to get a diplomatic solution. But that's going to take some time because both sides are digging in their heels. All sides have resources, and it's going to be a while before it sort of runs its course. Of course, they're having the UN High Commission of Refugees dealing with many of these issues, providing resources or providing funding, providing food, clothing, and other resources for the refugees, helping them with tents and so on. And they've done, what they usually do in such circumstances. They have not ignored the situation, but there are limitations. How do you deliver these goods? Often, if they're in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey, or neighboring countries, they can provide these resources. But they're only temporary means of support. It's not a long-term solution. They need to have the kids go to school, need to have the kids getting health care, and the families getting health care, nutrition, and so on. And the difficulty always is how many generations will be lost because of the conflict, not going to school, not having proper health and education. This is a very troubling trend. Of course, the host countries do the heavy lifting. They're the ones giving up their territory and their camps and negotiating. But small countries like Lebanon and Jordan don't have the means that the European Union and the Americans have, so they get a great deal of aid from them. There are many charities and many other non-government organizations helping as well, but they're coordinated through the country. Again, you have to be sure that the groups coming in are indeed doing what they're supposed to be doing and not doing something else. And that's always a difficulty. Vetting out the legitimate groups and making sure that the goods are received by those that are deserving rather than people who are opportunistic. I think the donors are very sympathetic to the UN High Commissioner's request for additional aid. Eventually, though, we have what's called donor fatigue. How much can be given, especially that there's so many crises occurring in different parts of the world. We have violence in Central America, we have instability in South Asia, we have the Middle East, we have the Gaza Israeli issue, we have Ukraine. So what happens eventually is there's exhaustion on the part of many of these donor countries on where they're going to give the money, how much they're going to give, and what's the end point. And you can see that in the voting patterns that you see in the European Union and many of their members in the US, voting on what we should be doing in terms of funding. But there is some concern about the lack of resources. They'll need more resources, of course, especially during the troubling winters where you need more facilities because of cold weather. And many of them, of course, are asking, how long will this continue? Again, it points out that what happens across the fence on your neighbor's side eventually affects you. So we're living in a globalized world. It's no longer that you can put up borders and keep your country insulated from what's going on. We have a great deal of people moving, and events that occur far away eventually impact you at home. I think the U.S., as in the past, will have to rely basically on its fundamental basic principles of providing aid to humanitarian crisis. Human dignity and respect of human rights are sort of hallmarks of our policy. We should try to avoid trying to promote our economic interest at the expense of our basic fundamental principles that are enshrined in our Constitution and our country's foundation. This, I think, would be the best policy to follow. Basic principles, human rights, fairness, and respecting these individuals. We, as a country, cannot solve all of these problems in these countries. They'll have to be resolved by the people themselves. And often a violent conflict is resolved, and then we could help in the rebuilding. If you have a generation that's lost, it's very difficult to get them involved in the modern economy. So often many of them end up in militias, working for and being paid by these militias, becoming parts of gangs, large armed groups. So it is a very negative social aspect when the children are not prepared for the future. They're unable to support a family because they can't find employment that's sufficient, and many of them don't have the skills necessary for a healthy, meaningful employment in the future. So it's a dysfunctional society, and many of the younger generations end up caring for these people in their later years because they're unable actually to do meaningful work in the society. We're seeing this also in the Arab Spring. Many of the people that are going to schooling are not getting those technical skills that are in demand for the modern economy. And this, I think, is recognized by many of the people that are in charge. We have to change the educational system in these countries so that they're more in tune with the modern economy. Yes, the Great Migration to the United States actually began somewhat earlier. We all know about the Pilgrims and landing in New England, and then subsequently the Puritans. That then in the 19th century started an enormous wave. Largest groups coming with Germans, Irish especially after the Irish famine. And that wave continued well through the 19th century. and peaked at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, especially with Italians coming in. And America was opening its arms and doors to everybody that wanted to come. We had Asians coming on the west coast to California looking for gold in the mountains. We had people coming from the south, from Mexico, and those areas coming and settling in the southwest. And we had huge numbers coming from Europe. Virtually every group. We had Scandinavians, we had the Irish, of course, we had the Germans, we had French, and we had later, of course, the Italians. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Italians, enormous waves coming basically for the same reasons we have now. Unemployment, poverty, lack of opportunity, coming to the great United States where the roads and highways were lined with gold. People coming here looking for opportunities, and many of them did find that. The East Coast was filling up, and many of them went west. And this continued up until World War I. Then there was an intermission, and then it started again between World War I and World War II, another intermission at World War II, and then another great wave after World War II coming to the United States. And that migration is continuing. The United States is receiving more than 1 million net migrants every year. These are legal, documented migrants coming in to settle. About 2/3 are family reunification, family members. Another third are basically for professional work, employment reasons. So the country is continuing this tradition, and I don't anticipate that it's going to stop. And at this point, we're about 320 million. And soon we'll hit the 400 million mark, maybe by mid-century. And I think that we'll continue growing. By the end of the 21st century, this country could be close to more than a 500 million people. About Ellis Island, many of them were coming in through that processing place, and many of them were stopped for health reasons. They had to disembark. Those that were not suited for the country in terms of health, many of them were sent back or treated. And many of them, of course, after a while, gained re-entry. And the great city of New York was host to many of these people coming through. And many of them did settle here successfully. And we have now certain sections of the city, Little Italy, the Chinese, Chinatown, and other areas that where these ethnic groups settled. And now they're moving around. This is continuing in the city as well. From my understanding from the demographics, the majority of children entering kindergarten today have at least one parent who is foreign-born. So New York City continuing in this process with Ellis Island, of course, not the major entryway. Most people coming in by plane or, as I mentioned, by family reunification, and our southern border, of course, increasing the numbers. So the flows from Europe that were enormous in the 19th and early 20th century have been displaced by flows coming from Asia and the southern border, Mexico, Central America, South America. Yes, this break in Islam occurred almost immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Succession was supposed to go to various leaders, and they did have 4 caliphs. But then there was a break in the 4th Caliph, Ali, where the one group thought we should follow the bloodline of Muhammad, and the other group said, no, we should go through the process of electing a leader who would lead us. And this conflict led to some martyrs, the sons of Ali, the grandsons of Muhammad, which then cemented this split between Sunnis and Shias. So as you move across from Morocco all the way across to the Philippines, you'll see various groups in different majorities and minorities. For example, in Iraq, the majority of the Muslims are Shia, a minority are Sunni. In Syria, it's the opposite. The majority are Sunni, the minority are Shia or other groups that are affiliated with that. And you move further east to Iran. Iran is predominantly Shia. And if you move to Saudi Arabia, they're Sunni. So you have various groups in different countries who have self-interests. And each group also within those groups, Sunnis and Shias, different views of how fundamentalist their views are. And it varies similarly to Christianity, Judaism. You have different groups who have different thinking on how religious you should be, how fundamentalist, how literal you should take the religious texts. And so you're seeing this. Fortunately, what's happening, though, is that in most of the 20th century, there was increasing tolerance. This lack of tolerance has sort of come back, and we're hoping that maybe with education and improved economic development that we perhaps could foster the tolerance among the religious groups in this region. It depends on the country you look at. There are differentials. In Lebanon, some years ago, the demographic transition where you see birth and death rates come down through development occurred more quickly, for example, in Lebanon for the Christians, the Maronites, Greek Orthodox. Then it was followed by the Sunnis, and then last were the Shias. So when you have differential growth rates, that means the proportions change. So the Shias, which were not the largest particular single group in the 60s, 70s, are now the largest group. And this, of course, affects democracies and voting patterns. Demographics and democracy are closely related, not simply because they have the root demos in it, but also because in democracies, demographics play a critical role. And this is what we're seeing. As the growth rates change, you have one group taking precedent over another group. And if you're a group that doesn't want to reproduce, very shortly you're not in that group anymore because you've disappeared. So numbers are very important, and these numbers are playing a critical role throughout the Middle East, also in Europe, and also in North America. Majority, minority, if they coincide with religious or ethnic divisions, linguistic divisions, are extremely important, and they can lead to civil conflict. So we see differential growth rates in these regions, and this is troubling to some, encouraging to others. Yes, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, end of World War I, basically the French and the British were leading in the reconfiguration of the Ottoman Empire. And these divisions were drawn without sensitivity to what was on the ground. Mount Lebanon, for example, was a small area where the Maronites and other Christians were living, and the French decided we'll make it bigger. So they drew a bigger Lebanon, Greater Lebanon, incorporating parts of what was at that time sort of Syria under the Ottomans, and incorporated within the country, not realizing that this was going to change the religious balance of the country. So now you have Sunnis and Shias coming into the country, affecting the demographic composition. Also, the lines between Iraq and Kuwait were drawn. Kuwait was basically a city, and they enlarged it to include land, and that's one of the reasons that we see some battles over where the boundary is. And this is not unusual. It occurred throughout Africa and other places where the boundary is drawn, and you keep having conflicts over where the boundary should be based on language, ethnicity, religion. And the battles continue now, and it's been, more than 100 years over these boundaries where they should be and where they should not be. The Ottomans were somewhat clever in that they oversaw the entire region, foreign policy and foreign affairs, and let the locals decide on the domestic matters, more or less. This may be some kind of formula that could be useful in the future, is to get more local autonomy to cities, states, provinces within a larger national framework. Trafficking is a major a global challenge, humanitarian issue that needs to be addressed. The numbers are difficult to ascertain because it's illegal, it's hidden. Some estimates put it as low as 4 million, others put it up to 20 million. So the numbers are difficult. They're in the range of millions, many millions. And the difficulty, of course, comes in ascertaining what level it is. The most visible part, of course, is sexual exploitation. Women and girls being trafficked, which account for about 3/4 of the victims, women and girls, most being women. But there's also forced labor, which accounts for about 36–37% of the reported victims or survivors of the trafficking. So we have an indication of the dimensions, but we don't know exactly how large it is because much of it is hidden and it's criminal. And those people who are the victims often are reluctant to come forward because if either they could misbelief that they're going to be put in jail, incarcerated, or deported. Often they come across borders without the necessary papers, and they're unaware of their human rights. So many, many millions. It affects virtually every country, irrespective of level of development. It's in Europe, it's in North America, it's in Africa, it's in Asia. And the countries of the world, most recently in the last 20 years, have decided that they want to address this collectively. The forced labor, in terms of the reported victims, is a smaller proportion. For sexual exploitation, it's about 60%, and 36% for forced labor. That gives you around 96%. The remaining 4% is a variety of begging, forced marriage, organ sale, trafficking organs, both internal ova, kidneys, livers, and so on. So the majority is sexual exploitation. However, the forced labor has increased in the last 10 or 12 years in terms of reporting because you're able to document it more. So the dilemma comes in is in assessing and measuring it properly. And we don't have a good handle on it. It's also the definitional issue. If a child is 12 years old and he's working making rugs, is he forced labor? And he's making money for the family so they can eat, and supporting them is helping the family work in the back room. It's just forced labor. So a great deal of it is unreported. And that's why we know that it's many, many millions. It's not just a few. We're only getting the victims. Also, countries often are reluctant to prosecute the traffickers. It's very, very difficult on the people being trafficked, the victims and survivors. It's very costly. And the criminals are often locals. Many of them are dealing with these issues. And although most are men, a good proportion in countries are women as well, trafficking, especially for prostitution. There's organized crime is involved, of course. Many of them are independent groups working on countries. It's a very lucrative issue, trafficking and smuggling, which is different. We have to distinguish between smuggling and trafficking. One is exploiting the people for long-term gains, forced either fraud or intimidation. The smuggling, of course, is also lucrative. This is basically moving someone across the border and charging them a fee for moving them illegally across the border into another country. But it is a lucrative profession. If you start looking at the numbers, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 to move someone, and also the money that can be gained by exploiting this labor. And it's only been a relatively short amount of time since we've banned slavery. The French and the British Empire, as well as the American nation, it's been less than 200 years since we've banned slavery globally. And we're still dealing with this issue of forced labor in many countries. That's correct. Trafficking doesn't have to go across borders. It can be within this country. There doesn't have to be any great movement. Usually it could be within the same town, the same province, the same state. About half of it is interregionally within the same region. Another quarter is domestic. Another one's sort of international across regions. So this differs from smuggling, which means you cross a border. Trafficking can be within a country. You can traffic someone from one house to the other side of the city and exploit them through deception, fraud, coercion, having them long-term doing work. It could be begging, it could be prostitution, it could be other types of servitude that they're using to keep this person working, basically denying them their basic human rights. It varies by region. Most of the ones that are reported are, as I mentioned earlier, women, then girls. They account for about 3/4, another about 15, 17% are men, and then another 10% are boys. But most of the children, every 3 children trafficked, 2 are girls. And most of them are involved in sexual exploitation. It varies by region. Some places like in the Middle East, a lot of forced labor. Africa, similarly, children involved in forced labor or sexual exploitation. And in Europe, largely sexual exploitation, not as much forced labor. So there is a regional dimension. A good source of the victims are coming from Asia, It has a large proportion of the population, and many of them are desperate, unemployed. So unemployment, poverty, desperation, lack of knowledge of your basic human rights affects these people and lays the groundwork for the traffickers. They promise them things. We're going to give you work. You can work in a hotel as a maid, or you can work in someone else as a domestic servant. And once they get there, often their papers, their documents are taken, and then they're coerced into working for the trafficker or his associates. And this then leads to a long-term exploitation. And then the person becomes dependent on them, afraid to do anything else, and that's where the authorities have to come in and assure them that we will protect them. Every region has trafficking. The difficulty comes in, of course, Africa, the reporting is less. You go to Europe, the reporting is very good, so it seems like it's greater there. But we have it in every region. So the data that we have indicates, of course, that large numbers are coming in the developed countries, but that's only a function of the reporting. So if you're looking in one place and you have very good microscope, you'll see things there. If you don't have any reporting in other areas, it looks like it's not the case, but it's basically a reporting issue, not a actual reality. And that's the dilemma that we have in trafficking. We need solid research, comprehensive research to try to measure the extent of it and make sure that we have clear definitions of what we're measuring, not be involved in things that are somewhat marginal. The U.S. has passed a great deal of legislation recently. It has an annual report. The U.S. State Department issues its annual Trafficking in Persons report. And they, in that report, group countries according to tiers, which countries are successfully implementing sort of the principles and recommendations of the protocol on human trafficking that was adopted by the United Nations. And they're providing funds as well as reports and assisting countries in developing skills and knowledge bases and staff and abilities, institutions to deal with trafficking. So they're very active in the United States, as the European Union as well. Many of the countries are actively pursuing this. It's a great change from, say, the 1990s. Since 2000, there's been a dramatic change in countries' commitments. There are 140 nearly countries that are signed on and ratified the protocol, adopted it. And the Americans are doing a great job, I think, in identifying what needs to be done, where are the problems in a situation that is basically criminal and hidden and hard to report. But having worked at the UN for years, we know that we're reluctant, the UN, to point fingers at countries. However, the U.S. State Department in the report are pointing their fingers at specific countries that are not implementing the policies that they should to sort of suppress and combat trafficking. And these often are in the news. Recently, the report highlighted Thailand and other countries, Southeast Asia, that weren't doing enough to suppress and combat human trafficking. Every country works under fundamentals. Demographics is very fair. It doesn't matter if you're Russian, American, Canadian, Brazilian, Japanese, the same dynamics occur. There are death rates, birth rates, and migration. Those are the three components of growth. Most of the Western countries and many other parts of the world, the death rates have come down, and this is wonderful, bringing death rates down. Infant, child, maternal mortality are low, and people are living longer than ever. But we've seen since World War II is that the rates of birth, fertility rates, have come down. And Russia, like many of the countries in Europe and elsewhere, have replacement levels that are very low. The fertility levels are not 2, but below 2 children per family is for replacement, basically. And they're having birth rates that are substantially low. And if this continues for a long period of time, the country starts to lose its population, decline in population, if it's not offset by migration. And that's very difficult to do because the numbers would have to be very large to replace the births if the birth rate's low. So you have many countries like Russia that have birth rates that are below 2, 1.5, 1.3, 1.4. And if this continues after a while, the population not only ages, but it becomes smaller. Now, this has some benefits environmentally, of course, but anything that occurs rapidly creates a shock. Demographics and economics are the same way. No one likes rapid changes. They like smooth changes. They want things to happen gradually so they can predict. If the birth rates are very low, as they have been in Russia, and the death rates have gone up as they did, especially for adult males, you have sort of a terrible condition, a perfect storm. High death rates, low birth rates. That means you're not getting the replacement of the population. Eventually the population and the labor force starts to decline, and then you start having a burden of fewer workers per retiree. And we're seeing that in many of these countries. Now, there's certain things you could do. You can make people work longer, which isn't a popular thing. Make them work beyond 65, maybe 70 or even more. Or you can bring in migrants to offset and sort of correct the loss in the labor force. Russia is struggling with this right now. It also is dealing with a good deal of illegal immigration, has several million, 3-4 million illegal migrants in Russia coming from the former Soviet Union republics, and this is also challenging them, how to deal with this. And then we have rises of groups that are hostile to immigrants coming in for a variety of reasons. So you have a very combustible mixture occurring in Russia. They've even had policies now to raise the birth rate. They have a love day, so to speak, where people encourage have children. And this is the same thing we've been seeing in other countries as well, be it Italy, Iran, Japan, Korea, trying to raise the birth rate. Often it's not successful because people make their decisions not in a Congress or Parliament. They make it in their own homes privately.